Do you think this kind of paves the way for a second, maybe bigger trade? And you've seen some reports nationally that Dan Gilbert has said you can take on some salary to potentially go for the playoffs. You know, with a 7-7 record and a team that's playing well with young guys, it's fine. You should start thinking, hey, we might be able to get 6th, 7th, 8th spot in the Eastern Conference.
Well, it's interesting because I was looking at some numbers from last year, and at this point, Dave, 1 month into the season last year, 13 of the 16 teams that were in the playoff picture went on to make the playoffs. So that means only 3 missed. So the odds, obviously, even though it's so early in this really weird season for the Cavs, the odds are favorable for them to do that. And as the Cavs were beating Brooklyn the other night, I got a text from a Western Conference personnel man that said the Cavs are getting the 8th seed. They play harder than anybody in the Eastern Conference, and they defend their butts off. And that's going to go a long way. There are certain teams that aren't going to want to deal with them for 48 minutes because they're feisty, because they continue to fight, because they're really, really physical. So there is a belief that the Cavs can continue this style of play, Dave, around the NBA, and maybe do have an opportunity to sneak into one of those final playoff spots. In saying that, yes, I think Dan Gilbert has always been willing to spend. I think the Cavs will be really judicious when it comes to that, though, because all indications are they want to avoid the luxury tax if possible. They're about $3.6 million away from the luxury tax at this point in time. And if they're going to go into that, it has to be for a relatively significant piece. They're not just going to go into that for somebody who's not going to make a significant difference for this roster, both in the short term and the long term. So yes, they're willing to spend. Yes, they're willing to make moves ahead of the trade deadline, but there's always a qualifier attached to that, right? It always has to make sense for both Dan Gilbert, the Cavs organization in the short and long term, and for general manager Kobe Altman. But because they have this extra roster spot, Dave, and we talked about this the other day, it is hard to trade somebody like Andre Drummond because he has such a high salary number. It's $28 million. And there aren't a lot of ways for teams to get to that number. And salaries have to match in the NBA when you pull off these kinds of trades. Well, now suddenly, because the Cavs have an open roster spot, they can do a 3-for-1 type trade for Drummond, or they could do a 4-for-2 type trade for Drummond. And that gives them, I think, more options in terms of potential trade partners in a deal for Andre Drummond. Or if they want to go the route of trading JaVale McGee, they could certainly do that. They could explore another deal for Kevin Love the way that they've been exploring those deals since basically the time that he got here and since he signed that big extension. So an extra roster spot means optionality, and I do think it makes it easier for the Cavs to take back more players in a potential Andre Drummond or Kevin Love trade in a way that they probably couldn't before the agreed-to deal for Kevin Porter Jr.